Hello, 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 and a warm welcome once again to Nestor's Bioacademy. And in this video today, we are going to further our learning on the axial skeleton, with the special focus being on the vertebral column. So by the end of this session, there's need for you to be able to describe the typical features of a vertebra, and there's also need for you to be able to describe the adaptations of the vertebrae. You also need to be able to identify the various types of the vertebrae that we have. Remember, in the previous lesson, we introduced ourselves to the axial skeleton, where we were able to list down the various components of the axial skeleton. We talked of the skull, we talked of the rib cage and the sternum, and we talked of the vertebral column. So in this lesson today, our special focus is going to be on the vertebral column. If you can recall previously when you were in primary school, getting introduced to science, you are learning that animals could be broadly categorized into two main groups. You are having the animals with the backbones, which we are referring to as the vertebrates, and then you're also having the animals without the backbone, which we are referring to as the invertebrates. But as you must have learned later on that we have different systems of classification, which was further putting down the organisms lacking the backbone into various groups, into various taxa. So what you are referring to as the backbone initially is basically the vertebral column. And much as by the time you were learning about it in primary science, you might have thought it was one continuous bone, but the truth is the backbone, what we're learning, perceiving as a backbone, is actually made up of several short bones arranged in a column at the back, forming what we are referring to as the vertebral column. So the vertebral column is this column of short bones arranged end to end at the back of our bodies, as shown in this illustration here. So the vertebral column is always made up of several short bones, which are known as vertebrae. Vertebrae is in plural, but a single one is referred to as vertebra. So in man, and by extension, a good number of mammals, we always have 33 vertebrae in total. And we always name these vertebrae according to the region or the part of the body where we find these vertebrae located at. Now, if the vertebral column was to be made of one rigid bone, it will really restrict a lot of movements. But by having the several short bones arranged end to end and with some cartilage between them, it offers some degree of movement that can be very important in enabling the animals move through narrow spaces. So between any two adjacent vertebrae, we always have a cartilage. This cartilage is always referred to as the intervertebral discs. This is the cartilage we find here. So they are not always arranged in direct contact end to end, but instead we always have a cartilage found in between any two adjacent vertebrae. So this intervertebral disc performs two main critical roles in the vertebral column, one being that the intervertebral disc absorbs shock, hence reducing friction, and at the same time also minimizes mechanical damage that can come as a result of some heavy trauma to the organism. Also worth noting is that the cartilage being relatively flexible, it makes the vertebral column to be flexible by allowing some degree of movement there. So that makes the vertebral disc, that is the cartilage we find between any two adjacent vertebrae, being very important in our human anatomy. So we always have 5 main types of vertebrae, and as I said earlier, these are named according to the region of the body where we find them. So we always have what we refer to as cervical vertebrae. Cervical vertebrae are these ones found in the cervical region, also the neck region. Then we have the thoracic vertebrae. Thoracic vertebrae are these ones found in the thorax region, as you can see here. And then the lumbar region also has got 5 vertebrae, which we refer to as the lumbar vertebrae. You can see them here. And then we have the sacral vertebrae indicated in green, and the caudal vertebrae indicated in the light purple there. All these vertebrae, from number 1 to number 3, they occur singly, but the sacral vertebrae, they are all fused together. Also, the caudal vertebrae are also fused together. So that is also something important to note, as we are going to see later on. Before we even go further to look into the basic pattern of the vertebra and the various features they possess, it's important to note that there are some terms that we'll be using here which are very critical for you to understand. These vertebrae, they can be identified from various angles. We can all agree that when you're looking in that illustration, if you are standing from this point, you see a 6. If you're standing from this point, you see a 9. What brings the difference is the angle of viewing. And therefore, also these vertebrae and these bones by extension, you can observe them at different angles, different positions of reference. And therefore, it's very important for us to know these terms of reference we'll be talking about, because most of the times you'll find us referring to the following terms: anterior view of the bone, posterior view of the bone, dorsal view of the bone, ventral view of the bone, superior view of the bone, and inferior view of the bone, or the caudal view of the bone, the cranial view of the bone. You will always find us referring to terms like the proximal end or the distal end. What will these terms be referring to always? When we talk about the dorsal end of an organism or a structure, we are referring to the side observed from the back side of an organism. And if you're talking about the anterior view, we are referring to as the front end of the organism. Posterior view, that is from behind. The ventral view is always denoting from the underside, or what I will refer to this case as the belly side. And then any organism usually has the main trunk. Like for this particular horse illustrated here, I can basically cycle this part here as the main trunk of this organism. So focusing on the forelimb here, if I'm moving in this direction, I'm moving towards the main trunk of the body, that is proximal. Towards the main trunk of the body. But if I'm moving towards the hooves, that is away from the main trunk of the body, I am moving towards the distal end of the structure. So these terms, we'll be using them interchangeably, and it's important that you understand them, because you'll be handling different bones, and it will be very vital that you be able to understand this particular bone. If it's a thoracic vertebra, if I look at it anteriorly, if I look at it posteriorly, if I look at it ventrally, and if I look at it dorsally, will I be able to identify it? How does it look like if I look at it dorsally, if I look at it ventrally? These will be very critical learning points there. It's also important to note that the way these terms are used differs, referring to depending on the type of the organism. If you look at the quadrupeds, or if you look at the bipedals, like us, For us human beings, for example, focusing on the illustrations given here, if I focus on the gentleman on this end, we are looking at the front view. But when you look at the front view for the case of man, it is also the same side where we have the belly. So in this case, the ventral and the anterior view are synonymous. They are literally the same views. If focusing on illustration A, if I was to stand behind this person at point X and I'm looking at this person from behind, I'll be looking at the hind view, so that will be posterior, the posterior view. But at the same time, I'll be able to see the back side of the the man, and that's why posterior and dorsal view become synonymous to each other. You can use them interchangeably. But coming back to the horse, if I stand at point X and I'm observing the horse, I'll be able to look at the front view of the horse. So that would be like the anterior view of the horse. But at that point, I cannot see the belly side of the horse. And therefore, for the case of the horse, the anterior view is exclusively very different from the ventral view. Again, if I stand from at point Y here, if I stand at point Y, I'll be seeing the horse from behind, the side where we have the tail end, and that will be the posterior view. But then if let's say short enough, I want to be able to see the back side on this end. So again, the posterior view and the dorsal view become quite different compared to the case of us that walk in twos. Just like, let me bring you to these illustrations. If these illustrations are representing this, if I'm looking at the cow from the front, this is the illustration I'll make of it. This is the view I see. So this is the anterior view. But on this end now, I'm looking at the cow from behind. So this is the posterior view. And remember, from this end, I'm not able to see the back side, referring to hiyo side ya mgongo. Siwezi ona mgongo wa ng'ombe nikisimama at this point here, point B. And then, if I was to be at a higher ground, let me say, nimesimama kwa ngazi juu, and then the cow is passing passing under. I can take a snapshot, and in this case, I'm seeing the back side. So in this case, I'll be saying I'm seeing the dorsal view of the animal. And for this case, this will be a lateral view because I am looking at the cow from the side. If we were to have a ventral view, it would be like assuming, let's imagine our photographer is down here and then taking a photograph from this end, then we'll be having the ventral view. So the knowledge of these views is as important as knowing the features of these vertebrae, because we'll be using them significantly. Now, having said that, let's now come to discuss the features of a typical vertebra. So a typical vertebra, one particular vertebra, if we look at one particular vertebra, we always have about 6 main anatomical parts, which are crucial for us to understand. We always have a solid part, we always refer to as a centrum. We always have some bony projections, we refer to as transverse processes. We also have another bony projection, again from this end, referred to as the neural spine. Then we have an arc of bone there, referred to as the neural arc. And then there's a canal there, an opening there we refer to as the neural canal. And then we always have some plane surfaces, which the vertebrae usually use to articulate or to attach to the bones which are adjacent to them. we call them zygapophyses. We're going to refer to look at them shortly. So in a nutshell, the centrum is always solid and broad, and this is always meant to provide support. The neural canal is always allowing the passage of the spinal cord. Take note, it is spinal cord, not spinal cord. Yeah, this is wrong. And then the neural arc also contributes to protection of spinal cord. Remember, an arc is a structure of this end, an arc. So if you look at this as the centrum, then this arc of bones this way is making up what we're calling the neural arc. So we can actually argue that the transverse processes and the neural spine, they are emanating from the neural arc. Then the neural spine provides surfaces for muscle attachment. And the same is also for transverse process. They also provide surfaces for muscle attachment. And most of the, in most cases, typical vertebra will always have two transverse processes. And then, as you can see from this case, we always have two plane surfaces. This one here, another one on this end. We call them articular facets, or we can also sometimes refer to them as zygapophyses. In plural, zygapophyses. So these ones, the vertebra, a particular vertebra will use to articulate or to join with the vertebra, the vertebrae which are adjacent to it. And typically we expect a vertebra to articulate with two other vertebrae, one in front of it and one behind it. So the two articular facets we find at the front end of a vertebra, we always refer to them as prezygapophyses. But the ones found at the back end, we always refer to them as post-zygapophyses. And of course, if you interact with the bones later on, you'll always realize the prezygapophyses, they tend to face inwards and upwards, while the post-zygapophyses, they tend to face downwards and outwards. Closer interactions with these bones will always enable you distinguish these. And again, that knowledge is also very critical because it can enable you understand and identify the view, the particular view of a bone that has been presented to you. So typically a vertebra has got the following parts, and therefore, by the way, you'll therefore make note of the fact that the zygapophyses are always four in number, two at the front end, and to the anterior end of the vertebra, which we call the prezygapophyses, and two at the posterior end of a vertebra, which we refer to as the post-zygapophyses. And how do you distinguish between them? The prezygapophyses, they tend to face upwards and inwards, but the post-zygapophyses, they tend to face outwards and downwards. And again, remember that this illustration here is only showing the representation of a typical vertebra. As we will be looking at the different types of vertebrae, we will actually realize that not all of them conform to this basic pattern. There are some of them that we will find to be lacking some of these parts, and there are some of them that we will find to be having additional features which we are not finding represented in this particular illustration. So having looked at this, the next critical thing we need to review is to look at the cervical vertebrae. Now, the cervical vertebrae are the ones we find in the neck region, And in man and most of the mammals, they are always 7 in number. So they are 7 in number. But then we always realize that not all of them appear the same. The first one is always referred to as atlas. The second one is always referred to as the axis. Then the third to the seventh are actually the ones which appear typically the same. They tend to be similar, but atlas is very different from the other 6. Axis is also very similar from the other 6. So it's important for us to understand their anatomical differences. What are the adaptations of these bones? So if we're to ask you in what region do you find them, you can simply say we find them in the neck region or in the cervical region. Now, the main distinguishing features of all cervical vertebrae compared to the other types of vertebrae we have just described is the fact that these vertebrae they possess some additional canals we are calling vertebraterial canals. These vertebraterial canals are always allowing for the passage of vertebral blood vessels and also nerves. Remember in the typical illustration of a vertebra that we discussed previously, we were only seeing one canal here, the neural canal for passage of the spinal cord. But we are saying that for the cervical vertebrae, in addition to the neural canal, they also possess additional canals, 2 of them, which we refer to as vertebraterial canals. And then they also, if you are to pick any mammal, you will always realize that the cervical vertebrae will always be the ones which will be having the widest neural canals. Why are they having the widest neural canals? This is always because anatomically, if we're to study the central nervous system, and then the part where the spinal cord descends down into the vertebral column, we always find that the spinal cord usually tends to be thickest at the neck region. So to accommodate this, the cervical vertebrae also, their neural canals are always very wide, and this enables them to also accommodate the spinal cord that is very thick at this region. So the very first cervical vertebra is referred to as the atlas. And we have just established that the atlas bone is very different from the others. And what is it that makes it very different? What makes it different is the fact that compared to all the other vertebrae, they always tend to have broad wing-like transverse processes. Of course, this is common to all cervical vertebrae. But then again, the atlas vertebra, it does not have a prominent neural spine. It has got a significantly reduced neural spine. Remember, neural spine was the projection we were finding on the neural arc, which was providing surface area for muscle attachment. Also, they have got a significantly reduced centrum. In fact, most of the times, one can comfortably state that atlas bone does not have a neural spine and it does not have a centrum because these features have been significantly reduced in the atlas. Then, of course, it also has some broad articular facets for occipital condyles. Perhaps this illustration would bring this into greater perspective. This is the neural canal. We expect the spinal cord to pass through here and exit here. This is basically the anterior end of the bone. This is the posterior end. But of course, this photographic illustration we are seeing here, this was photographed from the dorsal end. So this is basically the dorsal view of the vertebra. So if you look at this here is representing the transverse process. This is also representing the transverse process, and you can tell they are quite broad and wing-like. And then apart from this neural canal, there's always an opening here and another opening here. These ones are the ones we are referring to as the vertebraterial canals. So anytime you cite vertebral canals in a bone, that will definitely make the bone as a cervical vertebra. And then this one is now the anterior view of the bone. This is where we have an articular facet. These the two broad articular facets. Remember when you're looking at the skull, we said that posteriorly, the skull has got some two smooth protuberances at the back. So these two smooth protuberances, which we're referring to as the occipital condyles, they're the ones which should come and fit onto these two broad articular facets to form the joint that permits the nodding movement of the head. So these are still ventral views of the atlas vertebra. You can note the broad wing-like transverse processes that they possess. And again, as I said, if you are to compare this with the typical vertebra that we discussed earlier, you can, of course, note the differences. You are having a broad centrum for the typical cervical vertebra, but now you realize the centrum is not prominent. It is significantly reduced. We don't have something broad to provide firm support. Of course, it is understandable. Just above the cervical vertebrae, we have the head. We have the skull coming through. So of course the weight lying above the atlas vertebra is less compared to the weight that the other vertebrae like lumbar, thoracic, and sacral vertebrae have to support. And then also if you look at this other end, we were having a large bony projection we refer to as the neural spine. You look at the atlas and you realize we are not having a pronounced neural spine there. That's why we are saying that the neural spine is significantly reduced, or rather, the atlas bone does not really have a neural spine. So whichever view of the atlas bone presented to you, there is always need for you to be able to identify them, the bone. What are the main highlights you always look for? Look for a significantly reduced neural spine. Look for a significantly reduced centrum. Look for the broad wing-like transverse processes, and look for the broad articular facets that the atlas bone usually uses to articulate with the occipital condyles of the skull. If we were to describe the adaptations of the atlas bone, what would we talk about? So the atlas bone has got vertebral canals. Their significance for passage of vertebral, take note of this, for passage of vertebral blood vessels, and of course nerves. Then broad wing-like transverse processes to increase surface area for muscle attachment. Don't just say it has got transverse processes to provide surface area for muscle attachment. The transverse processes are there, but what is the adaptation? They are always broad and wing-like to increase surface area for muscle attachment. And then of course, it has got a wide neural canal significance for passage of the spinal cord, which is thick at the neck region. At the same time, also, as we have discussed, it has got broad articular facets anteriorly to articulate with the occipital condyles of the skull to form the joint that permits the nodding movement of the head. So also similar and important to note is the fact that we have got a reduced neural spine in atlas bone to provide surface area for attachment of muscles. Now, what are the key takeaways you need to have from this video? There is need for you to be able to describe the features of a typical vertebra. If we were to ask you, how is a typical vertebra adapted to its functions? You should be able to describe for us the fact that a typical vertebra has got a broad centrum to provide firm support, has got the transverse processes to provide surfaces for attachment of muscles, has got the neural canal, which is a cavity for passage of the spinal cord, presence of the articular facets to articulate with the adjacent vertebrae, presence of the neural spine to provide surface for muscle attachment. So you need to be able to describe them. We have said that between any two adjacent vertebrae, we always have a cartilage we are calling the intervertebral discs. Are you able to state the two important roles the intervertebral discs play? Very important. Are you also able to highlight the 5 types of vertebrae that we have and in the various regions of the body where we find them? And again, do you have a good understanding of the directional references, anterior, posterior, dorsal, ventral? Very important. And finally, can you recall the features of the atlas and the various ways in which the atlas is adapted to its functions? Having said that, you can take a moment to review this question. Ask yourself, you can pause this video and test your understanding if you can answer this question. Once you have made the pause and you have gone through the questions, I want you to explore something with me in the next few slides. So looking at this, sample response of a candidate could be this. A student identifies this bone as an atlas bone, which is correct. And then giving 2 reasons for the answer, talks of reduced centrum, correct, because this is repeated. And then state the view of the bone, and the candidate indicates this as an anterior view, which is correct. And what is giving this away are the articular facets you can see here very clearly, indicating that this one is the anterior end, because this therefore will be the side that is articulating with the skull. So this is the front end of the bone. Part A, vertebraterial canal, correct. Part B, neural canal, correct. Part C, articular facet, correct. Part D, transverse process, correct. Let's look at another sample response you can get from a candidate. Now, candidate 2 does not talk about atlas, but candidate 2 commits him or herself to talk about atlas vertebrae. And how many bones are we having represented? This is 1 bone, and therefore this one makes things slightly complicated. And of course, reduced centrum, that will score. Anterior view, that is correct. Vertebraterial canal, correct. Neural canal, correct. Articular facet, correct. But transverse processes, this will be wrong because D is just pointing to 1 transverse process. The other transverse process is found on this other end here. So this is a singularity plurality problem, and therefore this mark is lost here. Let's look at a sample response by candidate 3. Now, candidate 3 commits and identifies this bone as an axis bone. Of course, this will be very wrong because this is an atlas bone, not axis. And then therefore, reasons would definitely not score, however correct they are, because these questions would be tied. A very wrong identity for part A, Roman 1, would make the candidate to forfeit marks there. And therefore, this significantly lowers the chances of one scoring highly in this question. I hope you make note of those examiner tips as you continue to revise and cement your understanding of this very interesting topic. The topic of support is very, very important because this is one of the pillars of biology. You are going to be meeting these questions a lot, and therefore a very good mastery of this topic will give you a very, very strong edge if you are to do well in your biology exams. And therefore, I would like to stress for you the very critical areas. Anytime you are revising and reading through the topic of support and are going through the bones, it is vital for you to understand what would be the examiner's expectations of you Most of the times, we will always require you to identify the bone. You'll be given questions requiring that to identify the bones. And most of the times, we will always want you to give reasons for your identity. So knowledge of the distinguishing features of the bones becomes very important. We will always ask you to state the region of the body where it is found. And again, it's important for you to be very specific and avoid vague responses. Don't just say that bone is found on the upper part of the body, lower part of the body. No, specifically, where do you find it? Then identification of the various views of the bones. And this is where the knowledge of the directional references, anterior, posterior, dorsal, ventral views, the knowledge of those orientational terms become very important. Then, what are the roles of the bones? What do they play? Like in summary, the vertebrae, remember, all the vertebrae, they perform an important role in protection of spinal cord. They perform a critical role in providing support. And apart from providing a critical role, providing support, these bones, of course, provide surfaces for muscle attachment. And remember, these ones are critical and common to nearly all bones, actually. Then the adaptations of the bones is very important for you to understand. And again, also this, you might really want to hone your drawing skills, because definitely occasionally you'll come across questions requiring you to make illustrations of these vertebra, and you need to be able to make well-labeled diagrams of the same. Till the next video, take care and bye-bye.